They thought they could erase history with a pump and a few orange cones, but when I walked down to my creek that morning and saw men in HOA vests standing knee-deep with hoses draining the water into a storm pipe, I knew immediately this wasn't some misunderstanding, it was a declaration of war. Karen herself stood at the bank, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, pointing like some general on a battlefield, announcing that my creek was a danger to children and would be gone by nightfall. Her words echoed across the rocks while I stood still, letting her gloat before answering calmly, "You just drained the wrong man's creek, and one day you'll be explaining why your beautiful little subdivision is drowning in its own swamp." They didn't know I already had the plan forming in my head, and that the humiliation they thought they were handing me was going to turn back on them tenfold before long. When I first bought the land, I didn't come here for trouble, I came for peace. My grandfather had fished in this creek when he was a boy, and I'd grown up hearing stories of how the water cut through the valley like a silver thread, weaving life into the soil and shade for livestock. The property wasn't about prestige, it was about legacy. It was where I could work with my hands, watch the seasons move, without anyone telling me what color my door had to be, or how tall my grass could grow. That was the deal I made with myself when I signed the deed, and yet here I was less than 6 months later, already face to face with an HOA that thought bylaws were more powerful than rivers. Karen was the kind of woman who drove up in a spotless SUV with her sunglasses still on, as if even the sun was expected to obey her commands, and she wasted no time making herself known to me. The first time she showed up, it was in late spring. The creek was full after rain, and kids from a nearby house had been throwing stones into the current. She strutted over to my fence, wagging a finger, and declared that the creek posed an immediate liability hazard. She said the water was deep enough to drown a child, and mosquitoes would breed diseases that could sweep through the neighborhood. She spoke like she was reciting from some prepared speech, probably the same one she'd used to bully every other neighbor into submission. She tried to hand me a violation notice printed on glossy HOA letterhead, telling me I had 30 days to address the hazard. I remember holding the paper for a moment, then folding it neatly and tucking it back into her clipboard before saying, "You can't fine me for gravity," and walked away. She stood there stunned, and from that moment I knew this wasn't going to be a polite disagreement, it was going to be a campaign. Over the next few weeks her tactics grew more creative. One morning I found little red stakes planted along the bank of my creek, marking imaginary survey lines, as if the water was up for auction. Another day a black SUV cut across the edge of my field, tires flattening the grass as a man in a hard hat snapped photos. When I asked what he was doing, he said the HOA was evaluating the risk profile of the area and shrugged as though he was on official business. Later that week I received a fine for non-compliance, stating I owed $200 for maintaining an unregistered body of water. I didn't bother replying to that letter, because I knew exactly what game they were playing. Karen was waiting for me to react, to lash out, and give her something to twist, but I stayed calm on the outside, choosing instead to document everything quietly. Still, the situation gnawed at me, because the creek wasn't just decoration, it provided water for the small herd of cattle I kept, and it cooled the soil around my vegetable patch. It attracted herons and deer, and every evening, when the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the bank and listened to the steady rush of water smoothing stones. It was life itself in motion, and I wasn't about to let anyone bureaucrat it out of existence for the sake of some paranoid slogan about child safety. The deeper truth was that Karen didn't care about the children, she cared about control. She saw the creek as something outside her grip, a patch of wildness she couldn't manicure, and that unsettled her. She made her arrogance public at the next HOA gathering, which I was invited to under the guise of neighborly outreach. The meeting was held in a cul-de-sac where folding chairs lined the pavement. Karen stood at the front like a politician on the campaign trail and announced that the HOA was committed to progress, safety, and prestige. She said those words with particular emphasis. Her supporters nodded while she explained how the neighborhood creek was a hazard that reduced property values. She painted pictures of lawsuits and West Nile outbreaks while carefully avoiding mentioning my name, though every head turned in my direction at least once. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "The creek has been flowing here for 100 years without your permission, and it will flow for 100 more." You could feel the discomfort ripple through the crowd. Some smiled faintly, as if they wished they could clap. Others scowled, and Karen's smile tightened like a rope pulled too hard. After that meeting I knew the battle lines were drawn. The letters continued. The survey crews appeared again. The SUV parked by my gate more than once, but none of it surprised me, because this was how power addicts operate. They test the boundaries inch by inch, until they think you're too tired to fight back. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't planning to fight on their terms. I was studying their patterns, every letter filed, every trespass documented, every word recorded in my mind, while outwardly I maintained the same calm, slow drawl that made them think maybe I wasn't as sharp as I looked. I let them underestimate me, because that was part of the game. The day they brought the pumps down to the creek was the day the mask came off. Men in vests hauled hoses through the grass while a roaring generator pushed water into the storm drains. Karen stood with her clipboard nodding approvingly. Neighbors gathered around filming on their phones, half supportive, half curious. I walked down the bank slowly, boots crunching on gravel, and stood in the middle of them without saying a word for a long moment. When I finally spoke, it was simple. I said, "Remember this day, because one day soon you'll be explaining why your homes are sitting under 2 feet of water." A few laughed nervously. Karen rolled her eyes and told me property rights didn't apply to hazards, but I could see the flicker of unease in her face. I went home that evening and sat by the empty creek bed listening to the last trickle of water disappearing into the drain. I thought of my grandfather, of the deer that came at dawn, of the cattle that would nose the dry rocks searching for water. I let the anger settle into something sharper, not rage, but resolve. They thought they'd taken something from me, but all they'd really done was hand me the perfect stage for what was coming next. And while they celebrated their little victory with their clean lawns and safety speeches, I sat with pen and paper mapping out how to turn their pride into their downfall, because if they wanted to declare war on a creek, they were about to learn just how ruthless water could be when it came back to collect. They kept testing the edges like a child poking at a sleeping dog, small prods at first that were meant to wear me down and make me look unreasonable when I pushed back, and I watched each one with the quiet patience of someone who has learned that storms announce themselves in whispers before they break. A man in a hard hat came by one morning and planted little red stakes along the bank, as if to lease the water to himself, and when I asked what right he had to stride across my land, he smiled like a man who believed that smiling could rewrite deeds, and said, "We're assessing the risk," which is what bullies say when they want to look official. And the first time I confronted him, he shrugged and repeated the line, "It's for the children," as if the phrase could be used as a shield to hide whatever selfishness lay behind it. And Karen was never far, always visible at the edge of whatever mischief they staged, sunglasses on, clipboard held like a Bible, telling anyone who would listen, "We only want a safe neighborhood," the words falling out of her with the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed them in front of a mirror. But safety was a veneer. Beneath it there was management of fear and taste and control, and every tiny rule they invented was a string they hoped to use to pull everyone into line. Letters followed the stakes, glossy envelopes addressed in crisp type that used phrases like unregistered body of water and mosquito breeding ground, and each letter was carefully designed to seem legal until you looked closely and saw the weasel words that made it flimsy, the sort of notice you could wave at a neighbor to look like an authority figure while knowing it would fold under any real scrutiny. And I kept each one, stacking them in a manila folder that I began to call their playbook, because patterns reveal themselves if you read enough pages. The fines started next, tiny sums meant to sting but not to bankrupt, 200, then 500, always payable to some HOA account that had more committees than common sense. And the day they photographed my cattle drinking at the creek as evidence of harm to the neighborhood, I realized they'd crossed from petty to performative, trying to create a narrative where none existed so they could act out as saviors. And when I asked to speak to the board at their next meeting, they traded glances like theater actors and allowed me 2 minutes on the agenda, which they timed with a stopwatch like I was An unruly contestant on some civic version of a talent show. I did not yell, I did not plead, I said. My grandfather pulled trout from this creek when your street was a dirt track. You cannot stamp out a history you do not understand. And a woman near the back who ran the feed store muttered, "He speaks sense," which drew a sharp look from a young couple who nodded at Karen too eagerly, and that's when the chorus began to form, the small community voices that would be coin in the public currency of opinion. The feed store owner who knew me by name and who'd lent me a bale when the old fence gave way came up to me afterwards and said, "If you need anything, you know where to knock." His hand firm on my shoulder, his eyes tired because he had seen too many neighborhood fights turn bitter. Then there was Miriam, the retiree who kept a neat row of potted geraniums and who admired boundaries as much as she admired tidy hedges, but who confessed over coffee that she thought Karen had gone too far, and she said it in a whisper like she was betraying an old vow, while across the street a younger neighbor named Tyler, who had invested in the subdivision's glossy image, told anyone who asked that the creek diminished resale value, parroting lines Karen fed him over free wine at an HOA barbecue. And that division was exactly what Karen wanted, because if a community is split in normal ways, then monsters can hide behind normalcy. I tried reasoning with the sheriff because reason is what you offer when you still believe in institutions, but the sheriff's office returned a polite shrug and said, "This is civil, not criminal," and I could hear the unsaid part, which was that they had better things to do than sit with me in endless motions about water, so I started to record everything, not out of spite but because evidence is the only kind of memory an institution respects. I set up a cheap camera on a tripod disguised as a hunting stand that watched the bank, and when surveyors trespassed to plant those stakes, the camera ate them for breakfast, capturing the boot prints in the mud and the way one of the assistants tossed a cigarette into the grass without blinking, and I sent copies to the county, to a lawyer friend who would later laugh and say, "You've got them," and to my file labeled escalation, because judicial people like files, and when you hand them a neat stack of paper their eyes stop rolling and they start thinking in numbers. Meanwhile the HOA kept escalating in petty, performative ways, erecting those terrible yellow signs that read "Danger, keep out," which they nailed into the ground as though if you repeat a phrase enough the truth will bend to match it, and neighbors who were ambivalent before began to tape their phones to their steering wheels and record the theatrics, which created its own kind of accountability because people do not like being laughed at on camera. The SUV shortcut across my field happened on a rainy morning when the tracks were soft, the tires sank and left a mess I could hardly hide, and the driver hopped out to take pictures of the newly churned soil and said, "We're mapping the impact," in that same bland tone, and when I stopped him and asked, "Do you have permission to be on my land?" he shrugged and said, "The HOA granted access," which was a tautology when you think about it, like saying the sun rose because the sun said so, and that was when I realized their sense of entitlement was contagious. And their belief in their own rightness was the engine that would carry them from nuisance to catastrophe if left unchecked. The community chorus hummed in the background, some voices skeptical, some supportive, some boringly neutral, and I listened because every society is a mosaic of small decisions made by people who will later say, "I didn't know," and I kept a ledger of names, of who showed up to the pumps with hoses and who filmed from their porches with a bemused smile, because in the future I would need witnesses who knew what they'd seen and could not plausibly forget it. I made small, deliberate moves in public to maintain that calm everyone mistook for weakness. I watered my plants with buckets so my cattle would not suffer, I mended the fence where the SUV had rolled, I smiled and kept my speech measured when neighbors gossiped in the feed store about my stubbornness, because arrogance melts under the steady warmth of resolve, and while they amused themselves by inventing committees and emergency meetings, I was quietly mapping the storm drains, checking the municipal plans, learning where the pipes ran, and noting the exact places where their pumps bled my creek into their system, because a man who intends to win needs two things: knowledge and the patience to wait until the right moment, and that moment, though not yet visible, was gathering like a cloud on the horizon. The morning I walked down to the bank and saw the creek dry as a bone was the moment every ounce of patience I had evaporated like mist under a summer sun, because the pumps had done their work through the night, hoses still trailing like veins into the storm drains the HOA had chosen as their weapon, and Karen stood there with her arms crossed, smiling the smile of someone who believed they had already won the story, telling me, "Problem solved, the children are safe now," as if the erasure of a century of water was something to be congratulated. I looked at her, then at the men uncoiling their hoses, and the cattle behind me bawling in confusion at the dry bed where they usually drank, and I knew in that instant that their little campaign had crossed from nuisance into theft, and that I would never let it stand without an answer that would be remembered in the very foundations of their homes. I didn't yell, I didn't rush at them, I simply said, "You drained a creek that has outlived all of us. You think it won't find its way back," and I walked away with the sound of her laugh following me, a brittle sound that already carried more fear than triumph if you listened closely enough. That night I pulled out the county maps I had borrowed months earlier when this nonsense first began, maps of storm drains, water channels, runoff systems that threaded under their pristine cul-de-sacs like hidden skeletons, and I traced the lines with my finger until I saw it clearly, the arrogance of their decision laid out in blue ink and concrete tunnels, because the very system they had used to bleed my creek dry was the one that ran directly back toward their manicured lawns, their tennis courts, and the expensive basements they boasted about at block parties, and it took me less than an hour to understand what centuries of builders already knew. You cannot cage water without paying a price, and every storm that fell on my valley would bring that price knocking. Still, I didn't act rashly, I documented. I photographed the pumps, the signs, the trespassers with their cigarettes and survey poles. I stored the footage on drives and in folders, and I mailed copies to a county water board address that specialized in riparian rights, because Karen wanted a story she could control in the HOA newsletter, but I was writing one in evidence and law. The livestock went thirsty for a day until I ran pipe from a well, and my evenings at the creek became evenings at a dry bed of stones, but I used that time not to sulk but to prepare, and as I sat in the silence I began to lay out the bones of my plan. First, I would make sure the county understood what the HOA had done. Diverting a natural waterway without permission, interfering with established riparian rights, tampering with ecology in a way that could be documented in photos of dead minnows and cracked earth. Second, I would use the very storm drains they had chosen as their sword to turn the water back on them, not with explosives or violence but with patience and geometry, because all it would take was a reroute of the runoff channels and the storm that was surely coming, and their own arrogance would flood their doorsteps. Third, I would keep calm, never tipping my hand until the stage was public and the witnesses plentiful, because humiliation delivered in private is just bitterness, but humiliation delivered in the town square is memory. Karen kept circling, unable to resist her own appetite for control, staging a neighborhood barbecue on the edge of the dry creek to celebrate their victory, where she stood before neighbors and declared the water gone, the danger solved, the property values restored. They cheered politely, though I caught more than one uneasy glance in my direction as I stood on the outskirts, hands in pockets, offering no protest. She smirked when she saw me, raising her plastic cup like a toast, but I only smiled faintly and said, "Enjoy it while it lasts." That unsettled her more than shouting ever could, because calm confidence is the one thing tyrants cannot abide. They live on conflict, on you showing your anger, and when you deny them that, their own reflection becomes their enemy. In the days that followed, I worked quietly with the land itself. I reinforced a trench along my fence line that directed excess water toward the storm system, not in a way that could be seen as sabotage, but in a way that simply returned the water to the path they had opened. I laid stones where the soil was weakest, built diversions that looked like natural erosion, and every night I tested the flow with buckets, smiling as the water slid neatly toward their precious drains. The cameras caught more visits by the HOA surveyors, Karen hovering behind them muttering notes, and each time I compiled the footage, labeling it with times and dates, a silent record that grew heavier by the week. By midsummer the clouds thickened with the promise of rain, and with them the tension in Karen's voice as she passed me in the store, saying things like, "I hope you're adjusting to the new safety measures," with her smirk barely covering the twitch of unease in her eyes. She could sense something but not quite see it, and that is the perfect ground for paranoia to grow. I gave her nothing, only patience, because I knew storms would come whether I willed them or not, and when they did the land would speak louder than any man. But my plan wasn't only physical. I dug through the deeds and the records of ownership that came with my land, and there in the language written decades earlier was the clause I needed, a confirmation that riparian rights were attached to the property itself, meaning no association, no committee, no glossy letterhead could strip them from me without a court's involvement. That piece of paper was more powerful than any of Karen's clipboards, because when paired with the evidence I had gathered it turned every one of her moves into a nail in her own coffin. Still I did not reveal it, not yet, because timing mattered more than truth. The truth without an audience is wasted, but the truth revealed in the right moment is judgment. Neighbors continued to murmur, some emboldened by the sight of me carrying water buckets without complaint, others seduced by Karen's speeches about progress and safety. I let them chatter, because words are wind until reality arrives. In the evenings I sat by the dry creek bed, listening to the silence where water once sang, and I thought about my grandfather's hands pulling trout from the stream, and I swore to myself that this theft would not end with me sighing into the dirt. It would end with them standing ankle-deep in the proof of their arrogance, unable to laugh it off, unable to hide behind bylaws or slogans, because nature itself would testify. The turning point had come the moment they drained my creek, but the plan was now maturing into something sharper, and every time I looked at the storm clouds gathering above the valley I felt the weight of inevitability, the kind of inevitability tyrants never see until it breaks their glass walls. Karen thought she had erased my history, but all she had done was lay the foundation for her own public collapse, and I was going to let the water deliver the verdict. The storm came on a Thursday night the way storms often do in the valley, with no warning and no courtesy, just a sudden thickening of the air until the clouds pressed down heavy, and then the sky split open and poured its judgment onto the land, and while the neighborhood slept under roofs that had always kept them dry I lay awake listening to the gutters roar because I knew what was happening beneath the surface, I knew where the water was running, and I knew that the very channels Karen had used to bleed my creek were now filling like veins ready to burst. By dawn I pulled on my boots and walked out to the ridge, and from there I saw it unfold, the cul-de-sacs of the HOA drowned under sheets of standing water, SUVs stuck up to their wheel wells, manicured lawns turning into marshes, and neighbors standing on porches in bathrobes filming on their phones as reality sank into their basements. I walked down slowly, calm, the way a man walks who already knows the verdict before the judge has read it, and when Karen came stomping across her flooded driveway shouting that I had sabotaged the drains, I let her spill her rage before answering with the kind of quiet that cuts louder than a scream, saying, "You drained a creek that kept this valley alive. All I did was let the water show you what you had done." Neighbors gathered around, some laughing nervously, others openly recording as Karen's voice rose shrill against the backdrop of splashing water, and when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, tires sending ripples through the flood, the crowd hushed because this was the moment where words would meet authority, where excuses would either hold or crumble, and Karen clutched her clipboard as if it could shield her from consequence, telling the sheriff that I had diverted water illegally, that I was endangering the neighborhood, that I was a hazard. The sheriff listened, looked at me, and I calmly handed him the folder I had been building for months, the photos of the pumps, the footage of surveyors trespassing, the letters stamped with HOA letterhead demanding fines for a creek that predates their bylaws, and finally the deed itself with the riparian rights clause underlined in careful ink. He leafed through the pages, the rain dripping off his hat, and then he said flatly, "This is county jurisdiction, and by the looks of it, the HOA had no authority to touch this creek in the first place." Karen's face collapsed in front of everyone, her mouth opening and closing like a fish in the very water she had tried to banish, and someone in the crowd laughed, A sharp laugh that was quickly joined by others, the kind of laughter that cuts through pretense and makes it impossible to hide. I didn't gloat, but I delivered the line I had been holding in reserve for weeks, a line short enough to be repeated, sharp enough to echo. I said, "You drained a creek, I gave you a swamp, call it even." The crowd erupted, people clapping, some filming, some shouting, and Karen stood frozen, clipboard sagging in her hand, the sheriff shaking his head as he told her he would be forwarding this to the county water board, and that tampering with natural waterways carried fines she wouldn't want to imagine. Neighbors who had once parroted her slogans now turned on her, demanding answers, shouting about flooded basements, ruined carpets, mold that would grow by next week, and the phone cameras captured it all, a digital jury that would spread the humiliation far beyond the cul-de-sac. Tyler, the eager young man who had once talked about resale values, shouted at her that she had cost him tens of thousands and that she should resign, while Miriam, the retiree who had whispered her doubts, clapped loudly and said, "It serves you right for thinking you could own water." The feed store owner leaned against his truck, watching it all with a satisfied grin, the kind of man who has seen too many bullies finally stumble, and he nodded at me as if to say justice had come full circle. The fallout didn't take long to settle into the bones of the community, because the county water board moved faster than I expected, issuing fines against the HOA for illegal diversion, fines that drained their coffers faster than their pumps had drained my creek. And at the next HOA meeting the very same neighbors who once cheered Karen's speeches voted her out with no ceremony, replacing her with someone quieter, someone humbler, someone who began their tenure by apologizing publicly for what had been done. Lawsuits followed, some from neighbors furious at the damages to their homes, and Karen found herself not behind a clipboard but behind a lawyer's desk, trying to explain how she had engineered the very disaster that wrecked her supporters' basements. She moved away eventually, her SUV disappearing one afternoon without anyone waving goodbye, and gossip turned her into a punchline, with memes circulating of her standing in boots surrounded by water, dubbed captions like HOA Swamp Queen, and Karen's Resort, and neighbors shared them with the kind of laughter that has no malice, just the relief of watching arrogance collapse under its own weight. As for me, I went back to my creek, which flowed again stronger than before once the pumps were gone, the cattle returning to drink, the herons landing in the shallows, and in the evenings I sat on the bank and listened to the water like a hymn that had been briefly silenced but never forgotten. People from the community who once avoided my eyes now stopped by the fence to talk, some apologizing, some just shaking their heads at how far things had gone, and though I never rubbed it in, I made sure they understood the lesson, that land remembers, that water doesn't disappear just because someone with a clipboard says so, and that dignity is bound to the boundaries you defend. I reflect now with calm, not anger, because what they tried to erase ended up erasing them instead, and I think of my grandfather's hands pulling trout from the current, of the promise I made not to let arrogance strip the valley of its voice, and I feel no triumph, only steadiness, the kind you earn when you refuse to bend. So if you've ever faced a Karen or an HOA like this, tell me in the comments how you handled it, because every story of standing your ground adds weight against the tide of petty tyranny, and don't forget to subscribe for more, because these battles aren't just about land or water, they're about respect, and every time someone like Karen tries to take that respect away, it's up to someone calm enough to see the storm coming and patient enough to let it wash the arrogance away.